For years, a small group of scientists worked quietly inside an old space research facility on the edge of the city. Their dream was simple yet powerful: to build a satellite that would reconnect the world, one signal at a time. The team was not large or rich. Their computers were outdated, their tools worn, but their hearts were full of hope. Each night, long after the lights in nearby offices had gone dark, the faint glow of monitors still shone through their windows. They drank too much coffee, argued about designs, and sometimes fell asleep at their desks, but none of them minded. They believed they were part of something that would one day make their nation proud again. Their project wasn't just about science. It was about redemption. The world had forgotten what their country once achieved in space, and they wanted to remind it again. After years of late nights, broken parts, and endless trials, the satellite finally stood ready. It wasn't big or beautiful, but to them, it was everything. They had poured their lives into it, their time, their families' patience, and every ounce of energy they had left. The launch day arrived on a bright morning, the air filled with excitement and fear. The team gathered around the control room screens, hearts racing, hands clasped tightly. They watched as the rocket stood tall against the blue sky, sunlight gleaming off its body. For a few moments, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The tension was unbearable. When the engines roared to life, a wave of hope filled the room. The rocket lifted slowly, its fiery trail painting the sky. Cheers erupted, hugs were shared. It felt like their years of struggle were finally worth it. But fate had other plans. Just minutes after takeoff, a faint alarm started to beep. One of the scientists looked at the screen and froze. The data didn't look right. Something was wrong with the guidance system. Within seconds, that small error became a disaster. The rocket lost balance and veered off course. A silent panic swept through the control room as everyone stared helplessly at the monitors. Then the worst happened. A sudden explosion lit up the distant horizon. The room went silent. No one spoke. The sound of the blast echoed in their hearts. Their years of hard work vanished in a single moment. Some lowered their heads, others just stared blankly at the screen, tears quietly falling. The next few days were filled with chaos. News channels reported the failure endlessly, politicians blamed the team, and sponsors began pulling out. It wasn't long before rumors started. That it was human error, that the team wasn't capable, that the project had been doomed from the start. None of it was true, but the truth didn't matter anymore. The program was shut down almost overnight. The funding disappeared, the office was closed, and the team was told to move on. Within weeks, their names were erased from every official report as if they had never existed at all. Their dreams were buried under paperwork and politics. What was once a story of hope turned into a quiet tragedy. The satellite that was meant to unite the world had instead left them broken and forgotten. Each member of the team went their separate ways, carrying the same ache in their hearts, the pain of being erased. The world moved on quickly, as it always does. The headlines disappeared, replaced by new ones, brighter ones. But for those who had lived that dream, the silence that followed was louder than any explosion. Deep inside, a part of them still looked up at the night sky and whispered to themselves, "One day we'll rise again." Months slowly turned into years, and the once vibrant team that had dreamed of reaching the stars began to scatter like dust in the wind. Each member went their own way, trying to build a new life while carrying the same invisible wound, the feeling of being forgotten. The project that had once defined their lives was now nothing more than a closed file in some government archive. The world had erased their names, and in time people stopped talking about them altogether. Still, the silence that followed the failure was heavier than any noise. It lived in their hearts, whispering that all their years of sacrifice had meant nothing. Among them was Dr. Amina Qureshi, the woman who had once led the team with quiet determination. After the program's collapse, she packed away her lab coat, her notebooks, and the few photos that remained from their years together. She found a teaching job at a small university, not because it paid well, but because it gave her something to do, something to hold on to. Her classroom was small, her students young and eager, and though she smiled often, there was a sadness behind her eyes that only those who had known loss could recognize. She rarely spoke of her past. When students asked about her time in research, she would change the subject or simply say, "That was another life." Outside, she played the role of a calm and collected teacher. Inside, however, her heart carried the weight of a dream unfinished. Some nights after her lectures, she would sit by the window of her apartment, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She would look up at the night sky, her gaze lingering on the stars. They still looked the same as the day her rocket had failed, distant, shining, and untouchable. In their quiet glow, she saw both her failure and her purpose. She often wondered if the others ever looked up too, if they also felt that ache of something left undone. There were nights when she would take out the small metal pin that once bore her team's insignia. The edges had worn smooth, but the symbol still carried meaning. It reminded her of laughter in late-night labs, the shared hope, and the belief that what they were doing mattered. Sometimes she felt an urge to reach out to them again, to rebuild what had been lost. But every time fear stopped her. The world had moved on, and she didn't want to reopen old wounds. Still, deep inside her, a quiet spark refused to die. It was faint, like a whisper in the dark, but it was there. The sense that their story wasn't over yet. She didn't know when or how, but she believed that one day something would pull them all back together. As the stars glimmered softly above her, she whispered to herself, "Maybe we were erased from history, but not from destiny." Then she turned off the light, unaware that somewhere out there, another member of her old team was thinking the exact same thing. It was a quiet evening when Amina sat by her desk, grading papers under the soft yellow glow of her lamp. The hum of the city outside had become her nightly companion, filling the silence that once belonged to the sound of engines, test signals, and excited voices of her old team. She sipped her tea slowly, her thoughts drifting again toward the past she tried so hard to forget. Just as she was about to close her laptop, a small notification blinked on the screen. An unread message. The sender's name made her heart skip. It was from Eli, her former systems engineer. They hadn't spoken in almost 5 years. With hesitant fingers, she clicked it open. The message was short, almost hesitant itself. "Do you ever think we could try again?" Amina stared at the words for a long moment. They were simple, but they carried weight. Those 7 words seemed to breathe life into a part of her heart that had been quiet for too long. For years, she had told herself that the dream was over, that it was time to move on. But now, just reading that message, she felt a familiar spark, the same one she used to feel in the lab when they were on the edge of discovery. She typed a reply, then deleted it, then typed again. Finally, she wrote, "Maybe it's time we stop thinking and start doing." She hit send before doubt could catch her. The next week was filled with messages, calls, and old memories. Eli found a few of the other team members, the quiet data analyst who never gave up on a calculation, the communications expert who still worked with satellites for another company, and even the young intern who had once dreamed of becoming an astronaut. When Amina saw their names in the group chat, something inside her softened. The idea of rebuilding what they had lost no longer felt impossible. It felt right. They decided to meet in person. Not in a lab, not in an office, but in a small cafe tucked between 2 narrow streets in the old part of town. It smelled of coffee and hope. When Amina walked in, she saw them sitting at a corner table, older now, with lines of experience and time on their faces. But when their eyes met, she could see it immediately. That same spark that had once connected them. The laughter came easily at first, full of nostalgia. They talked about the past, about how things might have been if the launch hadn't failed. Yet somewhere in between the stories and the silence, something began to shift. The conversation turned from "remember when" to "what if." "What if we don't need a big agency?" Eli said, leaning forward. "What if we build something smaller, smarter, and make it work ourselves?" The room fell silent. Amina looked at him, the faintest smile forming on her lips. That night in that tiny cafe filled with the smell of old coffee and big dreams, the team that had once been forgotten began to believe again. What started as a meeting to relive memories turned into something else, a plan, a promise, and the first spark of a comeback the world would never forget. The decision to rebuild wasn't easy. When Amina and her old teammates began reaching out for support, doors closed faster than they could knock. Government agencies politely declined their proposals. Companies stopped replying to their emails, and investors smiled before saying, "We can't take that kind of risk." They all remembered the old failure, the explosion that had erased their reputation. No one wanted to be associated with a team that the world had already labeled as the ones who couldn't do it. But instead of giving up, the rejection only made them more determined. If no one believed in them, they would believe in themselves. They rented an old garage on the outskirts of the city, its walls covered with dust and rusted tools. The roof leaked when it rained, and the light flickered when too many machines were plugged in, but it became their new home. The sound of grinding metal and clinking tools filled the nights as they worked endlessly to bring their dream back to life. They didn't have expensive machines or the luxury of a lab, but they had something stronger: faith. They reused old parts from discarded satellites, borrowed equipment from friends, and found creative ways to make things work. One of the team members even sold his old car to buy circuit boards, while another used his savings to purchase second-hand testing equipment. Every night turned into morning, and every morning began with tired smiles and another pot of coffee. They would argue over blueprints, fix wiring under weak fluorescent lights, and laugh when small mistakes turned into funny memories. Sometimes they slept on the floor, using rolled-up jackets as pillows, but they didn't mind. The work gave them purpose again. Their goal wasn't to prove something to the world anymore. It was to prove to themselves that they were still capable of greatness. Amina often stood outside during breaks, staring at the night sky. She would whisper quietly, "We'll reach you again," as if talking to the stars themselves. Over time, their new design began to take shape. Unlike the massive project that had once failed, this satellite was smaller, faster, and smarter. It didn't need a giant launch vehicle or a huge budget. It needed only precision, teamwork, and belief. They built each component with their own hands, testing every detail again and again. There were days when exhaustion almost broke them. Power failures ruined data, tools broke, and sometimes they ran out of money completely. But someone always found a way to keep going. If one person felt tired, another picked up the work. Their bond grew stronger than it had ever been before. Months passed, and the satellite began to look real. Shining silver panels reflecting the dim light of the workshop. They stood around it one evening, their faces covered in sweat and dust but glowing with pride. Amina ran her fingers along its surface and said softly, "We built this from nothing." Everyone fell silent for a moment, understanding what she meant. It wasn't about glory or headlines anymore. This wasn't just a machine. It was their dignity, rebuilt piece by piece in the shadows, waiting to rise again. The journey forward was anything but smooth. The excitement that once filled the garage began to fade under the weight of endless obstacles. Their small fund ran out faster than expected, forcing them to pause work several times. Pieces of equipment broke at the worst possible moments, and suppliers demanded payments they couldn't make. Some nights, Amina sat alone after everyone had gone home, staring at the half-finished satellite on the workbench. The hum of machines had stopped, but her thoughts were louder than ever. She wondered if they had made a mistake trying to rebuild what the world had already buried. The faces of her team haunted her, tired, determined, and yet unsure. She could see the same question in their eyes that she fought within herself. What if we fail again? They tried reaching out to a few small investors, hoping that someone might see potential in their dream. But rejection emails came faster than replies. Some were polite, others were blunt. "The risk is too high. Your past record concerns us. We can't commit at this time." Each one felt like a quiet blow to the heart. Yet, even in disappointment, they refused to stop. They sold personal items, picked up side jobs, and worked odd hours to keep their project alive. Every piece of metal, every screw, every wire was paid for with sacrifice. There were days when morale dropped so low that even the sound of laughter disappeared from the garage. One of the team members once asked Amina, "What if the world was right about us?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked up at the cracked ceiling, her mind going back to that day years ago when the rocket had exploded and silence filled the air. That silence had felt heavier than failure. It was the sound of being forgotten. After a long pause, she finally said, "The world was wrong then, and we'll show them again." Her words weren't loud, but they carried strength, enough to reignite something in everyone's hearts. They learned to survive on the simplest things: cheap coffee, late-night snacks, and the kind of hope that doesn't fade easily. On some nights, when exhaustion hit them all, Amina would step outside and look at the stars. She would remember how they once symbolized loss, and now they looked like a challenge, a reminder that they still had something left to fight for. Slowly, the fire returned. The team began working with renewed purpose, fixing what broke, building what they could with whatever they had. When one person grew tired, another took over. When one idea failed, another was born. They weren't working for fame or recognition anymore. They were working for redemption. Each screw they tightened, each calculation they checked, was a step toward rewriting their story. They were no longer the forgotten engineers. They were fighters, dreamers, and believers. And though the world still doubted them, they had learned one powerful truth. Real success doesn't start with money or support. It starts with refusing to give up, even when every reason tells you to stop. The day of the second launch arrived quietly, without the noise of cameras or the glare of news headlines. There were no reporters, no officials, and no grand speeches. It was only the team, the same people who had once been forgotten, standing together on a small private launch site miles away from the city. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of fear and hope that weighed on every breath. The morning sky was pale and calm, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath for them. The rocket stood tall in front of them, not massive or shiny like those from big agencies, but strong, simple, and built with love and determination. Every screw, every panel had a story behind it. A story of struggle, faith, and endless nights that had led them here. As the crew made final checks, Amina walked slowly around the rocket. Her hand brushed against the metal, cool under her fingertips. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the first launch years ago, the explosion, the heartbreak, the silence that followed. This time felt different. They hadn't built this machine for recognition or applause. They had built it to reclaim what they lost, their belief in themselves. The clock on the control screen ticked down, and a soft voice announced the beginning of the countdown. T-minus 60 seconds. The team gathered around the small control console inside the viewing shelter. Some held hands, others stared silently at the rocket. No one spoke, but their faces said everything: fear, pride, love, and exhaustion all blended together. The seconds slipped away faster than they wanted. 10, 9, 8. The tension grew so strong it felt like the air might crack. 3, 2, 1. The engines came to life with a thunderous roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. The rocket trembled, then began to rise, slowly at first, then faster and faster, its bright flame cutting through the morning air. The sound was deafening, yet beautiful, a sound they had waited years to hear again. Some of the team shouted, others simply stood frozen in disbelief. Amina's eyes filled with tears as she watched the rocket climb higher, the sunlight glinting off its surface like a promise fulfilled. For a few seconds it felt as if time had stopped. The wind caught her hair. The sound of the engines echoed in her chest. And all she could think was, "We did it." As the rocket disappeared into the clouds, silence returned. But this time it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't heavy or painful, it was peaceful. A few tears slipped down Amina's cheeks, and she smiled through them. The team looked at each other, too overwhelmed to speak. They didn't need words. In that quiet moment, every failure, every sleepless night, every rejection was washed away. They had done what everyone said was impossible. They had risen again from the ashes. No one outside that small launch site knew what had just happened, but it didn't matter. The world might not have been watching, but the stars were. And this time, they had reached them. 2 days after the launch, the team gathered again in their small workspace, the same old garage that had witnessed their struggles and sleepless nights. The computer screens flickered softly in the dim light as they waited for the first signal. The air was heavy with tension. No one spoke. Even the sound of breathing felt too loud. Amina sat at the center console, her hands resting on the desk, fingers trembling slightly. She didn't want to say it out loud, but fear lingered in her heart. What if it had failed again? What if all their hard work ended in silence? The seconds dragged on like hours until suddenly a faint beep echoed from one of the monitors. Everyone turned toward it. The technician leaned closer, his voice shaking. Signal detected. For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted in cheers, laughter, and tears. The signal grew stronger and clearer with every passing second. The data showed that the satellite had not only reached orbit, but was functioning perfectly, better than anything they had built before. It was faster, more stable, and its range extended beyond expectations. They had done it. The satellite they built with borrowed parts and faith had made it. Amina covered her face with her hands as tears slipped through her fingers. It wasn't just success. It was redemption. Within hours, the story began to spread. Engineers from other countries noticed the new satellite signal and started asking questions. Space agencies tried to trace the source, confused about how such advanced technology had appeared without notice. Then, someone found the registration details, names long forgotten, tied to the failed project from years ago. The truth began to surface, and when it did, it spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, calling it the comeback of the century. One headline stood out everywhere. The forgotten engineers returned stronger than ever. Suddenly, the world that had once turned its back on them wanted to know their story. Emails poured in from journalists asking for interviews, documentary producers requesting exclusive rights, and universities inviting Amina to speak. The same institutions that once ignored their calls were now eager to celebrate their success. The small team that had been erased from history had become the center of attention again. But for Amina, it wasn't about fame or attention. When people asked for her comment, she only smiled and said softly, "We just wanted to finish what we started." She didn't crave recognition. She wanted justice, for the truth to finally be known. She watched her team, their faces lit up with joy, and realized that this moment was bigger than any headline. They had not just rebuilt a satellite, they had rebuilt their dignity. That evening, as the sun set, Amina stood outside the garage looking up at the same sky that once reminded her of failure. Now it was different. Somewhere up there, among the stars, their creation orbited the Earth, a quiet symbol of faith, resilience, and the power of never giving up. She smiled, whispering to herself, "We're back." Years passed, and the story of the forgotten engineers slowly turned into something larger than any of them had imagined. What had started as a quiet act of redemption became a lesson studied in classrooms around the world. Young students, full of dreams and curiosity, learned about the small group of scientists who refused to give up after being erased from history. Textbooks called them the erased team that rewrote destiny. But for those who truly understood, it was more than a story of science. It was a story of the human heart. The satellite they built continued to orbit Earth, its signal still strong, serving as a silent reminder that persistence can outlive failure. Amina had grown older, her hair streaked with silver, but her eyes still carried the same spark they did when she stood in that small garage years ago. She spent her time traveling from one university to another, not as a celebrity or an award-winning scientist, but as a mentor. Whenever she stood before young students, she spoke not about technology or equations, but about belief. "When we failed," she would say softly, "the world turned away. They erased our names from reports, removed our credits, and called us a mistake. But a dream doesn't die just because someone stops believing in it. It only dies when you do." The students would listen in silence, inspired by the calm strength in her voice. Sometimes, after her lectures, a student would approach her and say, "Your story made me believe I can do it too." Those moments meant more to her than any award ever could. She often carried an old photograph of her team, taken years before their first launch. In it, they stood together, smiling proudly in their lab coats, unaware of what life had planned for them. She would look at that picture before every talk and whisper, "We made it." News documentaries were made about their journey and their faces appeared in museums dedicated to space exploration. But what touched Amina the most was when one of her former students told her that children in small schools now learned about her story during Science Week. "They call you the woman who touched the stars twice," the student said, laughing. Amina smiled but shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "I just reached for them twice, the second time with my heart." Every evening, she still found time to look up at the night sky. Somewhere up there, beyond the clouds, was the little satellite they had built from nothing. She imagined it gliding quietly among the stars, shining with the same hope that once burned inside their small team. As she gazed upward, she often whispered, "They erased us from the stars, but you can't erase the will to rise again." Her voice was calm, her heart peaceful. Their story had become more than a memory. It had become proof. Proof that no matter how forgotten you are, the human spirit will always find its way back to the light.